Welcome in, latest episode of that SEC podcast. I'm your host, Michael Bratton. Go by SEC Mike on the Twitter machine. And there's our great friend, Steven Lassen, senior editor over at Athlon Sports. Steven, how are you, my friend?
Mike, I'm doing great. I have been working on the Athlon Sports College Football Magazine the last couple weeks, and despite it being the long off season, the college football world never stops for me. So excited to dig into all these teams this off season, but we got a long way to go. So trying to pace ourselves too, right?
Right. And hey, you're the perfect guest to have on, Steven, because we're going to talk about the upcoming college football season. I mean, literally, Steven just said it himself. He's already working on the preview magazine. It never leaves his mind where college football is and where it's going. So Steve is going to reveal his first top 25 for the upcoming season, subject to change, of course. We're going to be optimistic, one optimistic thing for each and every SEC team in 2025. And I've even asked Steven to kind of identify any traits that the past two, I can't even believe it, Steven. We're two consecutive national championships from the SEC actually winning one. I'm trying to figure out how did that happen and what teams in the SEC may have the pieces to break that trend, if that makes sense, in 2025. So we got quite a bit to cover.
Mike, I think the bad news for SEC fans is the Big Ten has a lot of good teams next year. The good news is, I think for all of the obituaries for the SEC and that it's over, that they're not going to win another national championship, the Big Ten is now the king. I would say slow your roll just a little bit. I think that the SEC will be back next year. There's a ton of depth in this conference. I think there are some national championship contenders. So long way to go this offseason, but I think there's a lot of reasons, as we'll talk tonight, to be optimistic about the 2025 season for a lot of these SEC teams.
Right. And of course, football's not over. So if you want to be optimistic about having a good time on Super Bowl Sunday, don't forget our good friends. Oh, forgot the logo. Boom. There you go. MyBookie, online sportsbook, mybookie.ag. They still got specials going on. With Shane, he's going to hop on tomorrow. We're going to talk about all the prop bets and everything for the Super Bowl. But there's a ton of them, Steven, including will someone fall down when they're walking up to do the national anthem? How long the national anthem is? I think cutaways to Taylor Swift. There's a lot of stuff to wager on for Super Bowl Sunday. And if you haven't already, help the podcast, go to mybookie.ag. That's the online sports book, and put in that promo code, that SEC. Still plenty of time to get in on the action before football comes to an end. You know what?
Is there a chance that our friends at MyBookie offer the Ian Johnson Fiesta Bowl special here, if you know what I mean? Like Taylor and Travis offers an engagement ring to Taylor maybe after scoring the game-winning touchdown or something. I don't know. That's pretty realistic, right?
It does. I also like Michael Riley. This is super realistic. Thoughts on the Chiefs getting all these calls in the Super Bowl? Yeah, I mean that's why I love SEC over this scammed NFL, but let's not belabor that point because I could go on and on about stupid refs. But
LSU and South Carolina Emory's nightmares.
All right, yeah, let's not we're in 2025 already, Steven. We're not going to rehash 2024. But there is one thing I did want to hit you with this real quick before we get on to all that stuff that I talked about. Shane Beamer got a contract extension. I haven't got your thoughts. Shane and I talked about it. For anybody that missed it, he got a new contract extension that Shane Beamer did that runs through the 2030 season, and he's going to make $8 million, Steven. That's the starting point, and every year it's going to go up by $100,000 until 2030. And you may say, "Well, my God, is Shane Beamer, is he worth $8 million?" Well, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 SEC coaches still paid more than Shane Beamer. Excuse me, 8 coaches, with Brent Venables tied with having an $8 million contract with Shane Beamer. So you put that into perspective. I feel like this is a good deal. Hell, I'd rather have Beamer than Venables if they're going to cost the same price. What's your thoughts on Shane Beamer getting a contract extension?
Mike, I think it is well deserved or well earned, especially after last season, where you go from 5-7 in 2023 to 9-4, and on the doorstep of making the college football playoff, going basically 3 winning seasons in 4 years, and also going to bowl games in 3 out of 4 years. Certainly, I think there's a lot of reasons to improve going forward, but at the same time, though, he's elevated this program. Now we're talking about South Carolina being a college football playoff contender next season. And we would not have been talking, I don't think, about that at the midway point of the 2024 season, considering where they were at one point. But it feels like Beamer has this program on an upward trajectory. And given the going rate for coaches in this conference, $8-9 million, even some Sark and Kirby Smart will be higher than that. That's kind of the going rate. And if you got a good coach, you want to keep him. And so I think, given the trajectory that South Carolina is on, it is a well-deserved extension for Shane Beamer.
Yep, I agree. Now he starts losing games next year, we got fire his ass. You know what I mean? I'll just be that guy. Sorry, but
a lot of times, Mike, those contract extensions aren't necessarily worth the paper they are printed on, as you know all too well. So things can change quickly in the SEC, one loss away from the hot seat.
Yep. All right. So, hey, speaking of South Carolina, I think they're going to make an appearance here, Steven, in your debut top 25 for the upcoming season. We're going to go through the entire top 25. Steven's also got a number of SEC teams inside the top 40. So, obviously, let's have an emphasis on the SEC teams in your top 25. But can you share your top 25 with us?
Absolutely. One thing I would share, Mike, is after doing this exercise, it feels like next year feels very wide open. It feels like there's not a clear-cut number one contender. So I'll kind of go through the first tier of teams here. Number one, I've got Ohio State. I don't feel great about them repeating, but I think given what they have coming back with Jeremiah Smith and Caleb Downs, and of course, they'll have to fill the defensive coordinator role with Jim Knowles off to Penn State. Kind of a safe number one for right now. So I've got Ohio State at 1. I've got Texas at 2 and Georgia at 3. You could flip a coin, I think, with these 2 and 3. If you want to argue Georgia is ahead of Texas, I would not disagree. But at the same time, I think those 3, much like Ohio State at 1, I've got Penn State at 4, Notre Dame at 5, and Oregon at 6. Those 6 teams seem to be a cut above the rest of college football going into next year, which brings me to the second tier, and it gets at Clemson at 7, Miami at 8, LSU at 9, Alabama 10, Tennessee 11, South Carolina 12. And I would kind of draw a line right there because I felt like all those teams were pretty close. If you want to rearrange the order, I could move South Carolina up to 10, move Alabama back a few spots. I could move LSU ahead of Miami. No real disagreement there. So I kind of felt like those are the tier 2 schools. And if you look just kind of beyond that, Arizona State at 13, Florida 14, and Kansas State at 15. Kind of another tier before you get into 16 through 25. Mike, has anything I said so far seemed too crazy for any of these teams?
Well, I don't know about too crazy. I don't know if you're seeing it on your screen, Steven, but I'm sharing this list with the Cousins live here. But how about LSU? This is one I really wanted to ask you. Again, this is your list. Everybody's got their own list. But I have started to see LSU on some people's top 25 hovering around the top 5 and being the highest ranked in the SEC. I've seen that. I think maybe it was Stuart Mandel or something like that. What would be your reaction to that? Again, you don't have it that far off. It's not like you got LSU 25 and other people got them 5. But could you see LSU making that jump and perhaps being better than you got Texas 2, Georgia 3? I guess the question is, would it absolutely stun you if LSU is the team to beat in the SEC?
I wouldn't be stunned because it does feel like Texas and Georgia, although I feel good about them right now as the early favorites, they both those teams have questions. I've like Arch Manning going to be a first time starter. I'm not really too concerned about a first time starting quarterback because number one, talent, we've seen him, and also first time starting quarterbacks have actually fared pretty well if they have the right talent and system. Now they have a lot of new pieces around him, but I think Texas and Georgia, you sort of just assume that turnkey operation, they're going to reload. I think the optimism for LSU for next season starts with like, hey, they got some ingredients that both Ohio State and I'll throw Penn State into this conversation for next year. If you start looking at teams that sort of fit like what Ohio State did well last offseason, LSU fits that this year. So I'm not necessarily surprised given they return a quarterback in Nussmeier that I think will be picked as one of the top 10 for sure in the country, maybe even preseason All-American. And also, I think you would expect that their defense in year 2 under Blake Baker is going to be a lot better.
Yeah, that was kind of when I asked you, who's got the pieces to fit that Ohio State Michigan mold. I'm not gonna lie, the team that was at the top of my list for that was LSU. That doesn't mean they're gonna necessarily get there, but that was certainly something that struck to me. How about Florida though? In your top 15, you got them at number 14 in your early rankings. 14. I mean, that's right there on the playoff cut line. And quite frankly, they were playing that way at the tail end, not at the start. But I don't know. I mean, I'm very high on Florida as well, but they got to earn that. I think that might be a little too high for me.
They are a tough team to figure out. I think I'll just kind of talk about like a process point of this. Once you get past like number 12 or so, I think on this list, a lot of these teams are pretty interchangeable.
Mm-hmm.
There's not a ton of difference. And I think that's kind of a theme for next year. Like not only is the top fairly close, it feels like these teams that are right there in the middle are kind of clustered together. So it's sort of like this year where one or two losses are going to be magnified, like in the playoff chase. But I think for Florida, you could look at it kind of two ways. I think number one, the end of the season, like they have to recapture that run. And I always think it is difficult to maintain momentum from one year to the next. It's a new season. There's a lot of variables. Guys leave the program. There are changes. Florida's had some changes to its defensive staff. So, it is really hard to sort of run this back. But also, I think you could say that DJ Lagway is going to be better in his second year as the starter. If they can maintain this defensive improvement that they did during that 4-game winning streak, there's a lot of reasons that they could make that jump into the top 15. So some of this is banking on returning production getting better, and also like some of the potential of the program you've been building now for a couple years. If those processes are good, and we sort of saw that at the end of last year, it should translate to something even better in 2025. So there's not a ton of separation in my mind between Florida and some of these other SEC teams that we'll talk about, like in the 15 through 20 range.
Mm-hmm. And no Ole Miss yet.
Yeah, so I've got Ole Miss at 19, BYU 16, SMU 17, Indiana 18, Ole Miss at 19. I think this might be a little low. And this next team that we'll talk about in Texas A&M is probably a little on the low side on this. If I had to redo it tomorrow, I probably would bump them up just a little bit. But Ole Miss is losing a lot off of last year's team. And I am going to be very curious to see how Lane Kiffin reloads. I suspect that they will fare very well, but also first-time starting quarterback. How does the offensive line develop? How do they replace a lot of those guys on defense? So kind of like, we talked about with Florida, are they going to be able to run this back? And I think there's a lot of potential, but I think right now as we head into, before we get into spring practice, there are some major questions, I think, about how this team looks in 2025.
Yeah, I think that's fair. But I also think Ole Miss has established themselves as one of the best programs in the conference. So,
yeah.
They don't just get bonus points for that or anything, but I think for programs like this, where shout out cousin Cameron saying, "Hey, Austin Simmons, he's going to be really good."
Agree.
I think you can he gets a little bit of the benefit of the doubt as opposed to, I'm just spitballing here, but like Marcel Reed, you know what I mean? Like that, and Marcel Reed could be fantastic as well. And we have seen more of him, so that's not really a great comparison. Trying to think of a better one, maybe like Jackson Arnold. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
give me Austin Simmons over Jackson Arnold right now, just because Lane Kiffin has proven it more recently, and they have an established culture of winning, whereas some of these other programs they don't right now.
Now that we talk about it, I could probably move Ole Miss and Texas A&M ahead of Florida. Like, so 14, like I'd maybe move like Ole Miss up to like 14, A&M 15, Florida 16. I mean, to your point, if you're looking at teams and programs that deserve benefit of the doubt, isn't it Ole Miss? I mean, I think with 3 double-digit win seasons in the last 4 years, and Lane Kiffin, he is the portal king. So you have to trust that he is going to reload the roster, bringing in one of the best transfer classes in the country. So I'm probably a little low on them at 19, but I always like to approach the first top 25 as like it's a starting point, and it gives me a good chance to kind of move teams around as we get into spring practice, and then of course later this summer with the release of the magazine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, that they're going to be. This is going to be a very, very interesting year. Can they sustain it? Ole Miss, that is, I'm talking about. Of course, I think they can, but came up short. What was it? The Last Dance? Well, if that was the Last Dance, we won 9 games in the regular season. That's not a ball I want to go to. You know what I'm saying? Like that should have been taking the next step. Instead, it was quite honestly, it was a slight step back.
I think the kind of theme that I would have for Ole Miss, and you and I have talked a little bit about this, is that sometimes it's not linear. Like, it seems like it should have happened last year given the roster and given the schedule, but it's also entirely possible that the pieces and breaks just fall into place for Ole Miss next year. I mean, we saw that. I think that's one of the questions that I think I'm going to be looking at every year is from 2024 to 2025, what is the turnover rate for playoff teams? Do we get like 7 out of the 12 repeats? Do we get more? Given that we have such a wide variance in roster talent now because of the portal to be able to move around, to me, that benefits a team like Ole Miss. The ceiling has got to be 10 wins. Your schedule's not too challenging to where you could make a run if the pieces fall into place. I totally agree on Austin Simmons. I think he is going to be a breakout star in the SEC next year. So I think Kiffin has earned the benefit of the doubt. He will also come into next season with some doubts just because of how much they lose. But also, I think you have to give him that benefit of the doubt, given how well they've reloaded and built the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm. And then how about the one final SEC team in the rankings that I don't believe you mentioned them yet.
Yeah, so 21, Illinois is at 21, Michigan 22, 23 Iowa State, 24 Boise State, and Missouri at 25. Not seeing a ton of preseason love for this Missouri team, but Mike, I like this combination that they've got going. You talk about programs that deserve the benefit of the doubt. I mean, Missouri, getting to double-digit victories each of the last 2 seasons. They do lose a lot off of last year's team. But similar to Ole Miss, you've got to give them, and I think this coaching staff, the benefit of the doubt that they can reload and find some new pieces just like they brought in through the portal. So I like Missouri's potential next season with the schedule plus the portal additions and kind of just giving this program the benefit of the doubt.
Let me ask you this though, Steven, because as we got the schedule pulled up from last year, obviously 10-3, outstanding. You won your bowl game, literally the only SEC program that can beat the Big Ten right now. So we gotta give credit where credit's due. They've done it 2 years in a row. Last team to beat Ohio State in a meaningful game, if you ask me. So all that and the other, but we were throwing Ole Miss into this category where they've again. I'll throw up Kiffin's record there. I mean, it's pretty outstanding. 10 wins, 8 wins, 11 wins, 10 wins. I mean, that's a track record you can rely on. Drake's got something similar, 11-10, but before that, 6-6-5. Um, Again, I've been called a Missouri. It's wild, Stephen. I mean, one year, 1 second you're Missouri Mike, and then the next you just hate us, you son of a bitch. But again, here they went 10-3. I just gave them all that credit. Did they win a single game, Stephen, where they were the underdog last year? And let's take out the bowl game because they may have been underdog. I think it was like a toss up. So and bowl games are weird anyway. But just the 12 games they had, I don't believe they won a single one where they were the underdog.
No, that's a good point. I think there's something to be said though, if I would say you're winning the games you should.
Right.
And for Missouri, your losses were to A&M and Alabama and South Carolina. Like none of those are terrible. I guess the question is, how do you go from that to taking the next step and consistently beating teams like A&M, Alabama, and South Carolina, now that South Carolina is a top 15 team for next year? So I think that's the challenge. Like it's for Ole Miss, like the path to get to the playoff is probably a little bit smaller, given that they've, Kiffin's got a little bit more time at Ole Miss than Drinkowitz.
Yeah.
But at the same time, though, like if you're Missouri, there's something to be said about winning every game that you should, but how do you get over that hump and get into the playoff, I guess, is be the question.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that is a totally fair comment. And I would also, just looking at the 25 schedule, they're going to be favored in. I mean, it's hard to say because we're so far out, but just looking at it on paper, I think they're going to be favored as of today against every team other than Alabama at home, I would say. Maybe Auburn on the road. Maybe A&M at home. And maybe Oklahoma on the road. And maybe you could throw in South Carolina at home. Those are 5 games, and they're not going to be underdogs in all those. But I'm saying I'm just trying to identify the games they may not be underdogs in, or they may be underdogs in, and it's probably 2 or 3 once again given this schedule. And yeah, absolutely to your point, it's not so much though. Yes, we do need to give them credit for taking care of business, but I guess my point is, the games they were underdogs in, A&M, Bama, and South Carolina, 2 of them they got absolutely destroyed, and it just, to me, it just paints a picture of a team that feasted on a schedule.
Yeah,
but next year they get another schedule just like it, so they could feast on it again. But I'm struggling to say this is a playoff team right now.
I think, and to your point, I think what comes to mind is if you couldn't get to the playoff last year, given the schedule and given the personnel, a senior quarterback in Brady Cook, Luther Burden, one of the most talented players in college football, how can you get back there this season with all the change and transfers that you're banking on being good right away? And I think some of that kind of goes back to, like, you trust Drinkowitz. You also look at that schedule and say, like, the breaks go their way this year. Maybe they lose twice. They can sneak in the playoff. They're going to have to pick up a marquee win somewhere. But I also think what your question gets at is, like, does it feel like the gulf between getting to the playoff this year and next year got wider? And it does feel like that for Missouri, to me, given even with a favorable schedule, just given the personnel turnover.
Right. And I would also say I certainly didn't think Indiana was going to be a playoff team, but Steven's already dubbed this the Indiana of 2024. So, that would be one heck of a ride. You know what?
There's going to be some teams like that. I mean, is it crazy to think like an Auburn, if the pieces fall into place? I mean, you've mentioned it a couple times now, like getting Georgia, getting Alabama at home next year. You have to assume that the offense for Auburn will be better. I've got them at number 30 in my way too early rankings here, but that's a team. Like, you can see that every year there's probably going to be a team that surprises everybody. And some of that is like the schedule breaking their way, Maybe it's the pieces kind of falling into place for a coaching staff that's been there the last couple of years. So we're due. The question is going to be who, and who's going to be bold enough to pick an Indiana type team to make it next year.
Well, I'd pick JR. I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
JR came through once again with another membership, this time Mountain Drew. Welcome to the family, Mountain Drew. Thanks to cousin JR. If you were doing a top 25, Steven, of fan supporters, you gotta put JR at preseason number 1.
Mike, I agonized over the number 1 team in my rankings, but no doubt about it. If I was doing a fan one JR, I wouldn't have to sweat. He'd be number 1 easily. That'd be the easiest number 1 I've had to pick all time.
All right, so you got Auburn just on the outside. Any other SEC teams you got just outside the top 25?
Absolutely. I've got Oklahoma and Vanderbilt and Arkansas just outside the top 30. Like if I didn't necessarily rank these teams. I kind of grouped them as I was putting together the top 30, but Oklahoma would probably be 31. I'd throw Vanderbilt at 32. I'd probably slot Arkansas in at like 35 or 36. All of those teams are super close to like this breaks their way. Couple W's here. They're in the top 25. It also, I think, speaks to, and this is kind of why I was saying, like, Mike, the Big Ten, they might be raising the banners and, celebrating. But next year, if the SEC has 14 of the top 35 teams or so, that's pretty good, don't you think?
I do. And there is something I wanted to ask you, because, again, you're more level-headed and more knowledgeable than anybody I know when it comes to this stuff. And I'm just wondering if you can combat this narrative that I think is foolishness. I mean, Ohio State fans, when they're not threatening to kill their coach for losing to the rival, which they have apparently, according to his wife, they threatened his life. That's a true statement. I have heard repeatedly in the comments section from those damn Yankees, Steven, that the SEC has lost its edge because they're not the only ones that can pay players anymore. But at the same time, they say, well, Ohio State didn't go out and buy their championship. What they did was they just brought back all this talent that they had a year prior and added a couple pieces. So it can't be both things, Steven. It can't be that we just brought everybody back and that the SEC is not the only one that can pay players. So there goes their winning advantage. To me, Michigan was certainly an outlier with Jim Harbaugh. We saw them. I know they beat Alabama. Good for you. Damn near half the SEC beat Alabama last year, by the way, too. But, Michigan, I don't think they'll ever do anything ever again unless Harbaugh comes back. And then I realize Ohio State's going to be pretty good. But what is it? What are the pieces that you saw from those teams that can be emulated? I realize I'm asking you a lot, but also, can you downplay that narrative that the SEC has lost their advantage, or do you think that's true?
I don't really think that's true, to be honest with you, Mike. And I say that because we almost just don't have enough data. Like there could be just a cycling going on here in the SEC. I do think if there is a question surrounding the SEC, like to me, it is coaching. You've now taken out Nick Saban. He's retired. He's the greatest coach of all time. How does Kalen DeBoer fill in at Alabama? What does Brian Kelly do at LSU? Billy Napier at Florida. You've got 3 of your top jobs in the conference. Mike Elko's on his second season. There's 4 of your top, 25 teams for sure, but also 4 of your top, 12 jobs in college football that have, some coaching uncertainty to some degree. So I think it's just kind of a weird time, like for the SEC. Quarterback play can be very cyclical, can be up and down. I think that's part of it. I think next year it's going to be really good in the conference. But also I think Michigan and Ohio State each capitalized on something, and they were the same in that they won the title, but they were different. They did it different ways. Michigan, slow build, Harbaugh had to go through some coaching changes, some tough times. Like in 2020, there was a question whether or not he was actually going to be the coach. And they sort of slow build the program. They recruit at a high level, but not at the level like Georgia and Texas do. And so when you get a team that has a lot of juniors and seniors, supplemented by select transfers to fill in gaps, you get a team like Michigan who can break through. Ohio State already had the elite roster talent, retained it. That's one check. They went out and got Judkins, Downs, a couple other transfers. So you supplemented your high level roster retention with elite, like fill in the gap type players. And then you made the coaching changes that you needed to. They hired Chip Kelly, which took Ryan Day out of the play calling element. So I think those three things are critical here. Like for Ohio State, it's retain your roster, it's supplement through the portal, and then you make the coaching changes. I would always prefer to have like a homegrown roster that's like bringing in 5 to 10 transfers to fill needs. Whereas Michigan had kind of been slow building to that point. And when you have this collection of massive junior and senior talent, the draft kind of illustrates that. That's kind of why I think a program like Michigan broke through. So they're the same, but they're also different too.
Yeah, shout out Cousin Rusty. Excellent point. Yeah, they also had everyone's signs for a year, too. Let's not forget the cheating ways. Shout out Cousin Salt Miner. I thought this was a great comment. The only thing the SEC has lost is total depth of each team. The total talent is still the highest of any conference. Coaching could improve. And Cousin Mike, he says, good point. NAL is depleting SEC depth, so injuries hurt more. And that is another thing. Again, this is not sit around making excuses, Steven, but I think in a 12-team model, again, we've only had 1 year of it, but I think it's fair to say it's going to be a battle of attrition. Notre Dame got really banged up. Had they been a little bit healthier, maybe they would have won it all. I know they came very close. I think the biggest one is kind of the obvious one, Carson Beck, Georgia. Not having him available, that who knows what that would have changed for Georgia, but that could have been huge. Is it fair to say that the way the sport is, I think injuries are they've always played a part, but with more games, with a longer season, the injuries will be a huge factor for championships moving forward.
No question. This is something that Ohio State talked about in the lead up to the national championship game was, the pace. Like Chip Kelly and Ryan Day talked a lot about using huddles and slower tempo to reduce the snaps that they were playing each season offensively. And I definitely think now that we've had one season, I think you'll probably see some other teams, adjust going forward too. I do think, the comment about NIL in depth is definitely something that I think is true, but also it could change quickly because we'll see what the House settlement comes out later this summer and what it does for rosters with the limit being 105 in the future for other conferences. So I think it has hurt, but it could also change going forward. And I think where, to the point of the cousins there, if you're second string at Georgia and you can go make more money and start at Missouri, like you're going to do it. So I think the talent level is dispersed a little bit. So it might be hurting the teams at the top of the SEC, but also helping the second class of the SEC. It hurts because they beat up on each other for the playoff race, but also you get a situation where there's like 14 of the top 35 teams in the nation next year.
Mm-hmm. And I apologize for just jumping around back and forth all over the place, Steven, but back to what we were saying about Ohio State and Michigan and their criteria. Who fits that bill in the SEC? We already talked about LSU. Could you also throw Texas into that conversation, given that Sarkisian's been there long enough now to where, the rosters and the culture is so developed? Is that the best target of that, or would there be another one there?
I definitely think LSU. I know we've kind of touched on them, but to me, it's like, yes, they lost Will Campbell, they lost Emory Jones to the NFL, but they retained Garrett Nussmeier. That's probably the most important piece of this. They have one of the best quarterbacks in the country. They also retained Harold Perkins too. We'll see how Blake Baker deploys him next season. And they also added a massive and very promising class of transfers too. So I think LSU kind of checks off a couple of those boxes. I think Texas, and it's hard to say Georgia because I think Georgia is the standard of college football because of their success under Kirby Smart. But also I could see they sort of fit the Michigan model of they've been building to this point. Like, yeah, Georgia was preseason number one, but they've just got so many talented young players that it should pay off. Like getting those guys snaps this year pays off. Like on Texas, they are losing quite a bit. Offensive line, they got some holes to fill on defense and at receiver. But I think you could point to this and say Sark has been building this roster now for a couple years. They were SEC ready at the line of scrimmage for the most part, unless when they played Georgia. But now they have Arch Manning, who can maybe take Texas from being really good to elite and winning the national championship. They've been in the semifinals for 2 years in a row, and they were like a handful of plays away from winning both those games. So they're close. And maybe that's where Arch Manning comes into play. He gets them over the hump next year.
Hey, shout out Cousin JR one more time. Man, what more can this man do for us? Thanks for keeping the season alive and the support for the rest of the SEC sports as well. Keep up the good vibes. Cousin JR, thank you so much, man. We appreciate you, buddy.
And JR, easily number one in my top 25 biggest supporters. So thank you, JR.
So Texas, LSU, any other teams that you're seeing? Georgia, of course, but would anyone else kind of fit that bill? And again, it's not going to be a perfect comparison, but any other SEC teams that could check a box or two there?
I don't know if there's necessarily another team, Mike, but I would throw out, what do you think about A&M as a potential like program development? I know you got, like me, you got burned at the end of the year. So.
Yeah, I've sworn off hyping them up, so never again. I'm currently compiling returning production. They're probably going to be number one, and we're all going to get excited again. But I mean, cases can be made, Steven, but the jury is still out. I'm standing by my statement. I will not hype up A&M ever again till they win 9 games in a non-COVID regular season. So I will not go there.
All fair points. I will probably be a buyer of Texas A&M stock, so I'm placing my hand firmly on the burner, prepared to get burned again next season. What do you think about, like, I don't think national championship good, but couldn't you make an argument that Florida, like building of like the programs, like not like it sort of fits the Michigan model, like patience in a head coach.
Yep.
Maybe, iffy recruiting at times, but you see some of the young players stepping in, and then you get the quarterback. Like for Michigan, it was JJ McCarthy, and for Florida, it'll be DJ Lagway.
Yeah, and I think I think we've seen enough of Billy Napier, Steven. Again, fair or not, you tell me. I'm not trying to kick the guy or anything, but I don't think Billy Napier's that good of a coach. I mean, I think that's quite evident. I'm not saying he's like horrible, but I think he's an average game day coach. But what I would say about him, I think he is very excellent at identifying talent. And they have done a good job bringing talent in there. So I thought, and I had said it all off season, you can check the tapes. I said, this is going to be his best team, most talented team. It made me look like a damn fool that I am the first month of the season, but eventually they got there. So I think the roster is going to be even better next year. Now, it will be a gauntlet once again. So, I mean, I hate to say this, but I think this is a reality. Can they overcome Billy Napier? And again, maybe that's not fair because I'm not saying he's some Chad Morris coach or anything, but he's far from elite, and they just have mistake after mistake, issue after issue. But that, if you have an elite quarterback, which I think they do, and many of the pieces to be a very good team.
I think there are some similarities, and I don't want to say like Harbaugh and Napier are the same coach because they're not. But it's funny because I remember after Michigan, and there was the debate about Harbaugh in 2020 about maybe he has too much on his plate. He needs to hire better assistants to modernize this or that. And they changed over a bunch of assistants. And of course, it helped them win the national championship. So I don't think they're necessarily the same. But I think you bring up a good point about Napier and whether that's like in-game decisions. We've seen like the same penalties over and over again. A lot of criticism about some of the things offensively at times. So, yeah, it does feel like maybe there's too much on his plate, and that Florida could take a step forward by Napier taking a step back next year and maybe handing off some of the play calling. And certainly, I think continuing to work on some of those penalties problems that we saw at times.
Right. And I believe he's come out, Steven, and said, I'm I don't think he's been this bold about it, but to my knowledge, they're not hiring an offensive play caller. So that's a missed opportunity.
Yeah, it wasn't. I mean, Vinny Sinceri might be like a great defensive mind, but it is kind of weird that they hired him as like a co-defensive coordinator already. Like Ron Roberts is, I mean, entrenched as the defensive coordinator, and they could have hired another offensive assistant. Doesn't that seem kind of odd to you?
I mean, nothing strikes me as odd anymore, Steven. But yes, that was an interesting decision. You know what's not an interesting decision, Steve, but it's more of a no-brainer? That's Rocket Money. Check them out. RocketMoney.com. And promo code Game On. That's how they'll know we sent you over there to Rocket Money. What is this Rocket Money? Personal finance app that helps you cancel unwanted subscriptions that are currently being billed on your dollar. Steven, we've all got these subscriptions that we're sometimes sometimes these places, Steven, they'll scam you. They'll get you for 2 Netflixes, 2 Amazon Primes, on and on and on. Well, this is Rocket Money. By click of a button, it will cancel that for you. Rocket Money has over 5 million active users and have saved people over $500 million in canceled subscriptions. So check out rocketmoney.com. Don't forget that promo code Game On. Personal finance app. Get your finances in order like me and cousin Shane have this year, thanks to rocketmoney.com, promo code Game On.
I think all of the SEC programs need to partner with this program, Mike. Think about all the subscriptions they can help cousins cut back on, which translates into NIL dollars to get that left tackle that or quarterback that you might need. So
exactly. I don't know. I know you don't follow basketball, Steven, but there was the Vanderbilt upset Kentucky over the weekend, and the AD of Vanderbilt was on the sideline pleading with the students, do not storm the field. We can use that money for NIL. What she should have been telling them is, go ahead, storm it. Just get you Rocket Money. We'll get that money somehow.
Yeah, Diego Pavia sitting back there just counting the dollars that he could rake in off of Vanderbilt paying that fine, as opposed to helping fund a little bit in Pavia's pocket next year. So yeah, I saw that. That was, man, Mike. I guess it only fitting that Mike and Shane start covering basketball of the year that the SEC has a great basketball season, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's why we're doing it. All right. Well, Steven, we've got so far. We've not even hit on the title of the episode. One reason for optimism for each SEC team. We got 16 to go through. Steven's got his list. I've got mine. We'll compare, contrast, see where it's at. We're going to go in alphabetical order. If you want to throw us a donation, certainly not required. But if you do, let us know your team. We'll throw them to the top of the list. So without further ado, Steven. Oh, shout out to Cousin Jet. He said, can Rocket Money cancel A&M's Jimbo subscription? I mean, if it could, it'd be worth its weight in gold, but I don't think there's any get rid of that dead weight. Let's go with Alabama. Steven, and it doesn't have to be one. I got a couple for some of these. One reason to be optimistic about Alabama next season.
Mike, let's go with defense for Alabama. Top 25 nationally in defensive success rate last season. I thought over the last 6 games or so that maybe things kind of fell into place for Kane Womack there after kind of a little bit of a shaky start. But I think the biggest reason to be optimistic is Deontay Lawson. Yes, he is coming back from a significant injury, but Keon Sabb, Justin Jefferson, Damani Jackson, like they have several key players that passed on the NFL. And they have an offense early on that is likely to be in transition with a new quarterback. So I think this defense could be really, really good for Alabama next year.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think that's what you got to hang your hat on. But I went with this, a little bit different. And this is not something tangible that you can kind of measure, Steven. But I just said 2 things. Obviously, it's year 2 of Kalen DeBoer, but I think expectations are off this program slightly. I mean, I know the fans are as rabid as ever, but hey, we just saw Stephen Lass's top 25. I've seen all these other top 25s. How many of them got Alabama 1 or 2? I mean, I haven't seen a one of them, which was obviously an annual occurrence. I mean, it was I think he started after Alabama's, where most of these lists started under Nick Saban. So expectations are diminished outside. I think that could help, but more importantly, not having such a chaotic offseason. Again, that's not something we can tangibly measure, but it goes without saying last offseason was a whirlwind. I think getting down to basics, getting Kalen DeBoer's systems all going in the right direction with a little bit less of, well, we're Saban guys, well, we're DeBoer guys, getting that all that cohesion on the same page. And don't forget Ryan Williams. I just wrote down Ryan Williams because who the heck would not want that guy on their team? You know what?
Oh, 100%. Easily one of the best receivers coming back next year. I first of all, I would also totally agree about your expectations. I think if you go like when Nick Saban was the coach at Alabama, I would remember when I first start the exercise, early top 25, whatever year it was, you write in Alabama at the top and you just sort of figure out if they're 1, 2, or maybe even 3. This year, it took some time. I mean, I had them 10th, but at the same time, I mean, I think you could have them a little bit lower. It's weird that they are, I think, one of the bigger wild card teams right now to figure out. Also, I am very curious to see how the quarterback situation plays out there because I think there's a case that next year's starter might fit DeBoer's offense better. Uh, Obviously, Milroe's super talented, but I'll be very curious if a Ty Simpson or an Austin Mack or somebody is able to execute that offense a little bit better. It might be a hot take, but that's something I'm workshopping this offseason.
Yeah, pesky old Alabama. Hopefully they can pull out an upset or two, like Salt Miner says. Well, they get Vanderbilt at home this year, so that's something. That'll be a huge break for Alabama. But let's move on, Steve. Let's go Arkansas. What do you got as a reason to be optimistic for them Razorbacks?
I think the first thing is the vibe is totally different. Certainly, Sam Pittman has a lot to prove again in 2025, but at least Arkansas had a winning season. They got to a bowl game. The hot seat talk is a little quieter this offseason. Still there, but a little quieter. But I think the biggest reason is got to be the development of quarterback Taylon Green. Second year as a starter, second year under Bobby Petrino. He was third in the SEC in total offense, averaged 7 yards per play this year, one of the best marks in the conference. So I think just having a difference maker like Taylon Green, who can take his game to the next level, with Petrino working with him all offseason, it feels like this ceiling for this offense, despite some new pieces, could be very high if Taylon Green can continue to develop.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's shown he can be incredible at times. I love that selection. How about this one though, Steven? I think Arkansas may have. I'm not saying without a shadow of a doubt, but I think they may have the best pairing of coordinators in the conference with Bobby Petrino, of course, and Travis Williams, who's done a remarkable job on that with the defense. And I would also say, I wrote down transfers for a lot of these teams, and Arkansas certainly transfers. But I would say their track record of developing and identifying transfers has been incredibly high. A lot of these guys, not necessarily household names, or some of them were, high profile recruits that didn't pan out their first school, yet they come to Arkansas and they do well. So I have said before, I think Sam Pittman's the real portal king. I stand behind that. I mean, he may not add 40 like Kiffin every year, but he's adding the right one. So I think optimism that the guys that they've identified and brought via the portal will hit this year.
I like that call, Mike, because I do like their portal class. I know it's probably not going to be as highly rated as some of the other ones in the SEC, Ole Miss, certainly LSU, maybe even Missouri. But to your point, taking somebody like Andrew Armstrong, going from Texas A&M Commerce to being one of the best receivers in the SEC. I mean, Taylon Green was very inconsistent at times at Boise State. It feels like he's on the right track now at Arkansas. So I think you have to staff continuity at the key spots, but also that they're bringing in basically like a transfer pretty much at every position. That, number one, it fortifies the depth, but also their track record of getting the most out of these guys, and that plays into the coordinators. Like, you trust Travis Williams, you trust Petrino to get the most out of this class.
Mm-hmm. All right, how about Auburn? He freeze did not make my list. I apologize, but what are you so optimistic about Auburn this year?
I kind of went with Hugh Freeze, but kind of in a different way. I said it's year 3. It's time to break through if you're Auburn. And so I think you have to say, the most optimistic Auburn fan, I think, would say, like, they've been recruiting well, they've been building, and maybe this is the time for it to break through. You've got your quarterback now in Jackson Arnold. You've got one of the better receiving groups in the country. The defense last year was 4th in SEC only games in fewest yards per play. So yes, there has been a lot of crazy up and downs, but maybe the foundation is set, and that translates with all the portal additions, finding the right quarterback, maybe some of the turnovers. That stuff sort of evens out next year, and that translates into a breakthrough year for Auburn.
Yeah, a lot to be said there. I'm still not sold on Jackson Arnold. I don't know how to evaluate him based on all the issues Oklahoma had last year. He could be incredible for Auburn. I think he ideally fits what Hugh Freeze wants, so that there's that. He was a turnover machine, though, and that's been a problem. So, again, for every positive I could say it's a negative too. So he's a complete wild card. But what's not a wild card, and this is obvious, is this receiving core. I said it's arguably the best in the SEC, and arguably may not even be the right word, with Cam Coleman, Malcolm Simmons, Perry Thompson, and Eric Singleton, the Georgia Tech transfer. So this is a game now of explosive plays and passing leads the way. So if Auburn has the best receiving core in the conference, I think they're poised to do big things next year. In year 3, as Steven said, if not, fire his ass. Come on.
John Sumrall eagerly following the Auburn results this year, perhaps. Do you trust Jackson Arnold more than Peyton Thorne at this point? I'm guessing no, right?
I don't know how you could.
Yeah.
Because not that obviously Thorne had his issues, but Thorne, Auburn fans will never say this. I don't know why. Well, probably because they hate him and they thought he sucked. But I'm trying to find, I don't have their schedule pulled up here, but last year, he was really heating up by the end of the year. He was playing his best football, whereas Jackson Arnold he ran wild on Alabama. But beyond that, see, like Ghetto Streamlabs says, literally no one can be worse than Thorne. Again, this is that is a comment not based in reality. I should be more prepared than this. I'm bringing up Peyton Thorne, what he did last year. Go ahead,
hey, Mike.
Uh-huh.
Peyton Thorne was 4th in SEC only games in quarterback rating, and 63% of his passes were completed in SEC play. So while he may not have been Jackson Dart or Lenora Sellers, I think he was far from the worst quarterback in the conference, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. I realize, again, I'm not a Peyton Thorne defender over here, but again, yeah. Against Kentucky, they won. He completed over 75% of his passes. A&M at 300 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, 60% completion percentage. Iron Bowl, 300 passing yards, 1 touchdown, 1 pick. I don't literally no one. Jackson Arnold, every game I saw except Alabama was literally significantly worse than that. So again, I don't want to belabor that point, but it's not a given. It's an upgrade. I'll just say that.
I like the pickup of Jackson Arnold, and I feel like there is more that he can give an offense despite last season, just because of all the coordinator, offensive line, receiver things at Oklahoma. But much like Alabama being a wild card, it feels like trying to figure out how Jackson Arnold is going to perform in this offense is going to be very difficult. It's going to be one of the bigger questions, I think, this offseason. So that's going to be something I think we'll probably debate most of every offseason show
We
this
got 9
year,
months
trying
to
to figure out what.
debate
So, yeah,
it.
right.
All right, how about let's move on to Florida, Steve. What's optimistic about the Gators this season? Uh-oh, I think we lost Steven. So I'll give you mine
20
first while we try to. Oh, sorry, Steven. Sorry to
So-
cut you off. Go ahead.
No, the finish to the 2024 season was probably my biggest reason for optimism, just because of the things you saw during that stretch. Like defense took a step forward, and also DJ Lagway showed that he could be sort of your franchise quarterback. Certainly some things to work on. The interceptions were a little bit high. Defense got to continue to get better. But I think the things you saw in that end of season stretch give you optimism that can carry over into 2025.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I think that's a solid one. I went with just the fact, obviously, DJ Lagway, but I didn't want to be just so obvious. So I said DJ Lagway and Jaden Ball combined, that may very well, I'm not saying it for sure, but I'm saying may very well be the best quarterback running back duo in the SEC. Florida fans know all about Jaden Ball. I think LSU and Ole Miss fans do too, but I don't know if the rest of the conference has come around to how good he is. And then to your point that you mentioned about the defense, Florida gave up 27.5 points per game last season to conference opponents, but that was mostly because they were so awful early. Late to end the season, they allowed 16 points to LSU, 17 to Ole Miss, 11 to Florida State, and 8 to Tulane. And I realize Florida State and Tulane, for different reasons, were not very good. But the fact that you're giving up nearly 28 points per game in conference, and then you held LSU to 16, they had a very good offense, and Ole Miss to 17 with their playoff hopes on the line. I think it goes to show that whatever it was that clicked for that Florida defense, I mean, it turned around in a hurry, and that's really something to build upon moving into 2025.
I think Billy Napier does a really good job of finding running backs. Like he had this track record at Louisiana that they would just sort of like a turnkey. They would lose somebody, the next guy steps in. And I think to your point, Jaden Bob, probably a little bit underrated nationally going into next season. But it did feel like their defense took hold because it wasn't because of Florida State and Tulane, like you mentioned. It was the Ole Miss and LSU performances. And with a lot of guys coming back next year, I think you have to be optimistic that carries over into 2025.
Yeah, and how about for Georgia, Stephen? What's got you so optimistic? There's many things to pick from here with the Dogs, but what maybe tops your list?
This is kind of a weird answer, but I think given the expectation is going to be win a national title, I think my reason to be optimistic is Georgia isn't that far off from winning it again. They can do it next year. And I think it kind of that reason sort of like encompasses every reason to like Georgia next year. You've got like Nate Frazier coming back at running back. You've got Noah Thomas and Zachariah Branch at receiver stepping in. So their receiving core should be better. And I think you just have to like roster talent plus trusting Kirby Smart to figure this out as the season goes along. So it almost feels like they have all the ingredients to win a national title. And the reason to be optimistic is Georgia will figure this out as the season goes along.
Yeah, and I said reason for optimism with the Dogs. But they're finally getting aggressive in the portal. And not that they haven't completely tried. I mean, they've added pieces here or there. But you mentioned Noah Thomas, Zachariah Branch, Micah Bell from Vanderbilt. I mean, they have a weakness at receiver. They've addressed it. They've quite frankly, they've tried to do that in the past. But again, this is more high-level spending. This is bringing in potentially elite players at that position to turn it around, to help whoever that next quarterback, likely Gunnar Stockton, if it's him or someone else, who that will be next year. They've really addressed that via the portal. Only 3 road games because you get two, one in Jacksonville, one in Atlanta. But yeah, only 3 traditional road games, and quite frankly, it's 2, Tennessee and Auburn. You own them. Doesn't matter where the game's played, and then the other was Mississippi State. So, I mean, they're going to be favored in all the road games. But let me ask you this. I know we're trying to be optimistic. I'm not trying to be a jerk here. But with Georgia, what did I outline there? I outlined the receivers and them getting aggressive in that aspect of their football team. But I don't know if you saw this, Steven. First time under Kirby Smart, Georgia was outrushed, was this year. So is it at all a cause for concern that all this big spending now is on receivers when I'm not saying like they shouldn't have got those guys. I think that was critically important. But for the first time, they were outrushed, which means they're leaning more on the pass game. Of course, maybe that had more to do with Carson Beck and his ability to throw the football. But it tells me that they were not comfortable that they could dominate the line of scrimmage, and because what Kirby wants to do is strangle you to death with the running game and his defense. Yet they were unable to do that. Any cause for concern that Georgia failed to outrush their opponents for the first time under Kirby Smart?
Absolutely. And I think it's going to be one of those areas that I'm going to be interested to see kind of what happens this spring. Like, how does the offensive line take shape? They're going to have some turnover there and some good players gone. But also, with Gunnar Stockton, I think there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic about how he played against Notre Dame, one of the best defenses in the country. But one way you can protect him would be to surround him with a good running game. Last year, I think Georgia was 15th in the SEC in rushing offense. Under just above 4 yards per carry. Very un-Georgia like production out of the run game. So it kind of does feel like getting back to basics a little bit, just because they can't afford to be one dimensional. But also taking some of the heat off Gunnar Stockton in his first year as the starter would be ideal.
Mm. All right, how about this one, Steven? I don't know if you had as much trouble as I did, but Kentucky. What are you most optimistic about the Kentucky Wildcats? And it can't be basketball.
Mike, I tried not to say like transfer class for every one of these teams, but I think it's a transfer class for Kentucky because last year the stats not safe for work. 14 points a game in SEC play, 122nd in the nation in passing offense success rate. There are 134 teams. This was a bad offense last year. So I think you have to like that Stoops and Hamden added several pieces that could help. Zach Calzada at quarterback. He started, played games for 2 SEC teams. He started at Incarnate Word last year. They've added 5 offensive linemen. They've added help at running back and receiver. So an offense that has major questions, has help on the way from the portal, would probably give me reason to be optimistic if I was a Kentucky fan.
Shout out Cousin Jet. He says, I'm optimistic Stoops gets fired this year, but that could be one too. But I went with, again, can't really measure this, but from what I understand, Steven, there was a little bit of a country club culture up there in Lexington, and to the likes of old Butch Jones up there in Knoxville, to where star players kind of got to decide how much they're going to practice or how hard or how physical. Now, I'm sure that's not the whole team or anything like that, but basically the way it's been conveyed to me, all the guys that were under that kind of set of rules are gone, whether they're in the NFL or they transferred out, what have you. All those guys are gone. I think clearly there were some issues. And then, we come to find out that Brock Vandagriff, hopefully he's in a better spot, but he's medically retired, and he came out recently and said, well, Stoops will me back. I don't know. That just kind of reeks of a lot going on there. Maybe he just love his love for the game. And if so, more power to him. I'm not saying he has to suit up here every week, but I know they were paying him a lot. So to lose it and still be getting paid, that's troubling. Again, I don't know. I think it was bad up there, and I think it's getting better, and it better. It better get better because it can't get much worse.
Is it fair to say addition by subtraction to some extent?
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm getting at here, because that's about the only spin zone I can do here. Hmm. But how about I think I lost you again, Steven. I don't know if you can hear me, but
I got you, Mike. Yeah.
okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead. How about for LSU? What do you got?
I'm going to go with Garrett Nussmeier's return. Uh,
Yeah.
I think having a quarterback like Garrett Nussmeier in his second year, just super valuable. A guy that could be the best quarterback in the country or one of the best. And certainly I like the portal additions too, Barry and Brown, Nick Anderson, replenish the receivers on the outside. Like the fact they added 2 offensive linemen in the portal. Obviously, losing Campbell and Jones is huge. But I think given that LSU should be better on defense, and now you have one of the best quarterbacks in the country returning, the foundation for LSU to take a step forward and contend for a playoff spot, all of that seems very realistic because of Nussmeier's return.
Yeah, certainly. And I had Nussmeier's return as highlighted as well. So I'll go in just a different direction because I agree with everything you just said. But I also had year 2 of Blake Baker's defense because it certainly strides were made. We weren't able to maintain it. I mean, at times they looked really bad and then on defense, and then they got better. I'm thinking of Southern Cal, that was rough. South Carolina for a time there was going up and down the field. Even Lenore Sellers only played half that game, but then by the midway point they looked like they had taken a major step forward, and then they started running into these guys that are called mobile quarterbacks that are new to the game, I guess, to Blake Baker. But if we could get that figured out, Steven, we have ourselves a defense. I mean, the last 2, Vanderbilt and Oklahoma, they had mobile quarterbacks too, and we figured them out. So I'm optimistic that our defense will take another step forward, and if they can do that, this very much could be a playoff team in 2025.
Totally agree, and I think that goes back to the Ohio State Michigan conversation for teams that could take a step forward. Is that you're bringing back a difference maker, a quarterback, and you have to assume. Well, never want to assume that could get worse. It could get worse on defense for LSU, but I think just given the fact that they've spent so much money in hiring Blake Baker, brought over Bo Davis to coach the defensive line, they went into the portal, they got 4 defensive linemen and a couple defensive backs. This defense, it may not be the best in the conference, but it feels like the ingredients are there to take a step forward next season. And that could really help LSU close the gap to getting into the college football playoff next year. And frankly, it's probably one of the reasons why, you mentioned it, like LSU's getting some top 5, top 6 preseason buzz by some people. It's probably optimistic about the defensive improvement.
Mm-hmm. How about the Ole Miss Rebels, Steven? What has got you so optimistic about them in 2025?
I'm going to go with the program foundation is strong. Yes, Jackson Dart is off to the NFL. Yes, they are losing some guys on defense too. Certainly, the talent gone is significant. But they've had 3 double-digit win seasons over the last 4 years. And I think Kiffin has the right formula. I would love to see more homegrown talent, from the high school ranks break through and be consistent starters for Ole Miss going forward. But they've got a breakout quarterback in Austin Simmons. They've added several pieces from the transfer portal. And I also trust Pete Golding. I think they'll figure this out on defense. Certainly, they're going to miss Walter Nolan. They're going to miss some of those other guys. But this is kind of like a trust factor. I trust Kiffin. I trust Golding. Program foundation is strong. Despite the turnover, I think they should be a playoff contender next year.
Yeah, I think I'm right there with you, and I agree. It's funny. It's like you're looking off my notes here, Steven. I said active in the portal as always. The culture, which is kind of the foundation that you spoke of, and the fact they went to the bowl game last year, and everybody thought, oh, Duke Mayo or what bowl game did they go to? They went to the Gator Bowl.
Yeah.
Everybody said, oh, this is gonna be opt out city. Well, it was, but for Duke, I mean, Ole Miss had everybody but one guy. So, and a lot of that, I'm not naive. A lot of that is a strong NIL, a collective that knows what they're doing. So that theme will continue. So we have all that, but I'm highlighting Austin Simmons because I'm buying into the hype. I know we've barely seen him play, but I think shout out cousin Zach. I was just about to say this. He could be better than Jackson Dart, and could that's a strong word. Will he be right off the bat? Probably not, because I think that's disrespectful to Jackson Dart, because Jackson Dart was very, very successful and highly productive. But let's call it what it is, Stephen. At times, now they whooped Georgia's butt, so we got to give him that. But at times, he came up short in key situations. And that's not all on him. You know, sometimes it's the line, sometimes it's other positions. But maybe Austin Simmons can be a little bit more clutch. And what little we have seen from him, he is clutch, clutch, clutch. So I just think Austin Simmons potentially raises the ceiling of what this Lane Kiffin Ole Miss offense could do. And I'm putting my stock into that, with fair or not.
I'm on board with Austin Simmons as a breakout candidate next year. In fact, probably one of the top breakout quarterbacks in college football. I also think I like that early schedule too for Ole Miss. Like, certainly going to Kentucky, given what happened last year, we shouldn't assume that Ole Miss will win in Lexington. Arkansas will be tough, LSU, but I mean, five of their first 6 games are at home before you play Georgia, and then 3 out of your last 4 are at home. That's a pretty good formula for a first-time quarterback in Austin Simmons. And this is kind of gets back to the trust factor. I sort of just trust that, hey, whoever is starting at Ole Miss is going to put up numbers in their system, and they've replenished the offensive skill talent through the portal, which makes me feel good about the supporting cast for Austin Simmons next year.
Right. And speaking of supporting cast, their Ole Miss coach, this next sponsor, sports him. TryJoyMode.com. Don't forget this Try Joy Mode promo code SEC. We get you 20% off at the checkout, or 30% off if you start up a subscription service with Joy Mode. It's TryJoyMode.com. What is this Joy Mode, Stephen? This is a natural supplement designed to enhance blood flow. As Shane says, that's what's keeping his mic stand going. So give him a try, tryjoymode.com. All you got to do is simply mix a packet of water, mix it with some water, and in about 45 minutes, it takes effect, and you get total control of Joy Mode with a boost anytime, anywhere. Never miss a beat with this sexual performance enhancer, certified by cousin Shane. Shane told me over the weekend he missed Saturday. He's missing today. Why is he? People say, why is Shane always late? Or why is he not showing up? Why do we got to get Steven on here multiple times a week? Because Shane is addicted is a wrong word, but his wife is more addicted to Try Joy Mode. So tryjoymodetoday.com. And don't forget the promo code SEC for 20% off your purchase, or 30% off a subscription service. Try Joy Mode. Lane Kiffin approved. All right, Steven, how about Mississippi State? What are we excited about there?
I hate to be boring, Mike, but let's go with the transfer portal class for Mississippi State. Certainly, I think last year was a year 0 type situation for Jeff Lebby, given the scheme transition, given the roster transition. It just feels like they're entering 2025 in a much better spot. So the transfer portal class is pretty stocked. I mentioned Fluff Bothwell, great name, old name teamer. I think he's going to be a really nice pickup at running back. But I think their best additions come on the defensive side of the ball. About 10, 11, 12 guys on that side of the ball from the portal. That has to translate into improvement, because they gave up almost 39 points a game in SEC play last year. So you have to hope new faces from the portal, plus maybe some new assistants on the defensive side, translates into improvement, which helps this team contend for a bowl game next year.
Yeah, living on a prayer is what I'm going to say this team. But we got Blake Shapen back. And anything you could say bad about Jeff Lebby, the one thing you can't say, I think the guy may be the best quarterback coach in the country. I mean, his track record is insane. I never even heard of Michael Van Buren outside of some recruiting stuff. And I thought he was at times, he looked like a junior, not a true freshman. Blake Shapen thrived under him last year at Mississippi State as well. So you got Jeff Lebby, you got your quarterback, senior leader back. That's about as positive as I can get. I don't want to be negative or anything like that, but I'm afraid we are. I mean, we all know where we're at. So I again win a conference game, and if you do, it's going to be because you're outscoring folks. It's because you got Jeff Lebby calling the plays. It's because you got Blake Shapen better than ever, staying healthy, and just firing that pigskin, and hopefully outscoring somebody.
I think that makes a lot of sense, Mike, because I mean, just looking at their defensive numbers from last year, and I'm still very skeptical that Coleman Hutzler is the right guy for that defense after year one. But I think you could look at the personnel and say now they're in a better spot in terms of talent, but also the amount of defensive linemen that they're going to bring in makes me curious about what kind of scheme they're going to run up front. Because I mean, if you're bringing in 5, 6, transfers on the defensive front, are you going to try to maybe switch to a little bit different scheme, or are you just adding a lot of depth? I mean, they've got a lot of guys coming in on that side of the ball, which they desperately need. And so it feels like, given that they were winless in conference play, 2-10, it feels like on the surface, this transfer class plus getting into year two gives them a chance to at least kind of catch up to the pack and give them a chance to maybe steal an SEC win somewhere, because that schedule was very difficult in 2025.
Right. Well, going from a difficult schedule to a manageable one. How about Missouri? What are you most optimistic for them Tigers?
I apologize for using the same language, but I will do it again. The foundation of the program is strong. 21 wins over the last 2 years, 2 top 25 finishes. Bulk of the coaching staff is back. Got great news too with Tristan Newsome. Looks like he's going to come back next year. So getting a key senior back in the mix, like what they did in the portal. Damon Wilson, Josiah Trotter, the West Virginia transfer at linebacker, I think could be a real playmaker for them. And then, of course, Bo Prabula. Getting your quarterback from the portal to step in and start for Brady Cook, I think he'll fit that offense well. So good schedule, great foundation. I think the transfers, I think Drinkowitz brought in another great transfer class, and I think that gives Missouri a chance again to be a top 25 or better team next year.
Yeah, I like a lot of what you had to say. But again, I was kind of, I don't know if mocking is the right word, but I was highlighting the schedule. I'm going to highlight it here. I mean, it could be seen as a negative. I think it could be seen as a positive too. I mean, my goodness, just finish the deal, and don't get embarrassed, and try not to get banged up. Had the offense been how effective it was at the end of the season, had it been that effective from the go, I think Missouri would have made the college football playoff, and we would have been hailing Drink as one of the coaches of the year. So he's not far from it. I mean, again, 10 wins. They just won 10 games, Steven, and we're picking apart. They didn't win enough. You know what I mean? Like, Missouri is in a very unique and it's like a golden era of Missouri athletics, and I think they're right back there next year if they hit on the quarterback Bo, and if a couple pieces come together, the defense continues to take strides. I thought the defense last year started out incredibly strong, kind of fell apart a little bit at the end, but man, they got everything you need. I know people, some people, a lot of people, right, do not like Drink. I love him. I love the shit talking and the craziness, and you just never know what you're going to get out of him. So that's another reason to be optimistic. You got a coach that keeps you in the conversation, and more importantly, he wins football games, because none of that other stuff really matters. But I love it. I love it for the content and the engagement and all the fun stuff. But I think he's reason to be optimistic.
100%. Not only for the trash talk, not only for stirring it up and trolling. I think it's just also gets back to what he's done on the field, the last couple of years, getting Missouri to a big time bowl game last year in the playoff conversation this year. It's hard when you lose like some guys like Brady Cook and Luther Burden, and you could look at that season and say it might be a little bit of a missed opportunity given what they had in the schedule. But also, I think if your foundation is strong, and it is at Missouri, it gives you a chance to run this back next year with some new pieces and still also be a playoff contender. So it's not a lot of reasons to be unhappy right now, I guess, if you're a Missouri football fan, right?
Right, and I've got his info up here. I mean, this is going to sound crazy, Steven. I'm not saying they're equal coaches or anything necessarily, but he's the closest we got to Steve Spurrier right now. And I remember growing up, I hated Steve Spurrier because he always whooped Tennessee. But looking back, I mean, I grew to love the guy just because he would always run his mouth, and that's what Drink does.
That's a good comparison. I really haven't thought about that, but I guess if you were a fan of like Tennessee or like South Carolina,
Georgia,
or Oklahoma, or some of these others, like I could see how like some of the like Drinkwoods could get on your nerves, but at the same time, like it's great like to have the back and forth between these guys and the trolling that goes on. So sign me up for more of that in 2025.
No doubt. Well, speaking of a team that hates him, how about Oklahoma? What are you most optimistic with the Sooners?
It's got to be John Mateer plus Ben Arbuckle. Oklahoma's offense was 117th nationally in offensive success rate, 4.2 yards per play in SEC only games. The offense should be day one ready. Like, you have a coordinator and a quarterback who work together at Washington State. Yes, it will take some time to adapt and get settled, but we've seen this at other schools. Like, the offensive coordinator and quarterback both go into the same spot. It has worked out well. So I think for Oklahoma, given where they are, you have to think that combination can turn things around. Also, surely Oklahoma can't have that many injuries in the receiving core and offensive line next year, right?
Well, I certainly would think so, Stephen. Bill beating Bo, Bob beating Bo, Bo beating Bo. That's all I heard the offseason. So I heard he was the greatest thing since sliced bread, and he may be, but the unit didn't showcase it last year. I'll tell you that.
That is for sure. Now they've added help from the portal. They shouldn't suffer that many injuries. You would think they'll be better next year. But also, man, getting Deion Burks back is so huge. Like, he was one of the probably preseason all SEC picks, and just being hurt all of last year hindered that. But this year with Mateer and Arbuckle, I suspect that he's really going to take off in this offense.
Yeah. So I basically said they've scrapped the offense, which I think that's very optimistic. With you mentioned it, John Mateer, Ben Arbuckle, and essentially cleaned out the receiving group. So I don't know that the receivers were a problem by any means, but they were banged up, and there was all kinds of issues there. So starting from scratch, but I don't know if that's a winning formula when your coach has got his back against the wall and you're in year 2 of the SEC. Your arch rival just went to the Final Four 2 years in a row. I don't know if you want to be starting from scratch, but that's where it is, and you have to be optimistic that they'll hit a grand slam, and then all of a sudden they're one of the elite because they already got the defense. I think they already got the special teams, but I mean, it goes without saying. We all know the offense was a nightmare. So if you turn it from a nightmare to, just be, you don't have to be Joe Burrow good, but just be just be solid, and this team can make the college football playoff. So that's kind of what I'm optimistic about when it comes to the Sooners.
On the subject of Arbuckle and Mateer, don't you think it's like maybe the best case scenario for Oklahoma, short of like if they could land like Carson Beck or something? I mean, something like crazy like that. I guess getting an offensive coordinator and a quarterback who work together, implementing a similar or same scheme with a coach that's got to win right away. There's no like ramp up time. Like, you're just saying like, go, we've got the system. These two know each other, and the other piece has got to learn it. But new OC and quarterback, I would think that's probably like your most optimistic case, right?
Yeah, and I believe, to Brett Venables' credit, I give him a ton of crap on here, but it's my understanding, Stephen, that was the decision from the moment they fired Seth Luttrell. We're going to get a coordinator, and he's got to bring his quarterback. Now, you can call that tampering, you can call it whatever you want, but I mean, I thought it was hilarious. I don't know if you saw this. I know this is a little off topic, but the Athletic did a piece on Beck going to Miami, and it was and the coordinator says, "Yeah, I mean, we scouted every quarterback in the country, and there's only one I wanted." And again, um, to my knowledge, Beck wasn't even in the portal yet. They had to deal with him. So everybody cheats. Everybody's doing this. So I'm not calling out Oklahoma for doing this, but I think that was very strategic. And to your point, I think that's not the only, but you give yourself a significantly better shot of it taking off immediately if you do that, as opposed to trying to hire the best offensive coordinator that you can, trying to hire the best or hire that's what it is, but sign, land, whatever the best quarterback you can, and hoping they work together. That they know that these two pieces work together. So that's gotta give you some optimism.
I think given the urgency, I think that's probably the best case scenario, because I don't think,
Right.
with a 6-win season would not sit well at Oklahoma. Maybe there's some paths there that make sense, but if you're trying to win right now, Mateer plus Arbuckle, given their history, probably makes the most sense for Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm. All right. How about South Carolina, Steve? What's got you most optimistic about them Gamecocks?
2 words: Lenoris Sellers. Might have no might about it. He's got a pretty strong case to be like a preseason All-American next year. But I think he fueled that 6-game winning streak at the end of the year that got them close to the college football playoff. If you look at his games in the month of November, 67% completion rate, 12 touchdowns to 3 picks. Also, 10.4 yards per attempt. Those were some of the best marks he had all season. He was coming into his own and sparked South Carolina down the stretch. So I think he can be even better in 2025, and that is why I am optimistic about South Carolina.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, that's the first 2 words I got as well, Stephen. Little Sellers, the Little Sellers, the Little Sellers. But I also went this way because I thought you might go there. They gave up 26 points per game not last season, but the season prior. And that dropped down to 18 this year. So took a massive step forward on the defensive side of the football. Clayton White, shout out Clayton White. He should have got more respect, I think, for being a Frank Broyles contender. If we could continue that trend, and I know a lot of that's probably Kyle Kennard and Dylan Stewart being amazing, but if we could continue that trend, and I'm not saying we got to cut 18 in half, because that would be, you'd have the best defense in the country, which, I mean, they certainly could. But if we could just continue that trend and keep improving, I think the defense went from a huge question mark to a strength of the football team. I think that's a one heck of a sign for the Gamecocks going into 2025.
Absolutely. And we kind of saw some of that, like going back to the end of 2023. It felt like the last few games of the season, they turned a corner a little bit defensively, and they have some turnover, obviously, going into 2025. But that's kind of where Sellers in this offense could really make up, at giving your defense some time to find the right pieces, get all the new pieces acclimated. So South Carolina is in a pretty good spot for sure on both sides of the ball.
Mm-hmm. Now, how about Tennessee? And I'll be honest with you, Stephen. I mean, this was not to be Debbie Downer, but it was a little bit hard for me to come up with the number one thing. There's lots of reasons to be optimistic, but what is that top reason for the Vols? I'm fascinated to hear what you say.
I would love to hear your feedback on this, because I'm going to go with Nico's second year. I think high expectations coming into 2024. Not bad. 19 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, around 64% completion rate. I think some people like myself probably thought he would be a little bit more prolific, given what Tennessee had. And some of that might have been Dylan Sampson being so good, Tennessee built its offense around him. But I think there's a real need and also an expectation that he has to take that step forward next year because of what Tennessee is losing. They lose Sampson. They've revamped the receiver room. Some guys gone on defense. if you're going to make the playoff again next year, it has to be your young quarterback taking that next step. And so I think my reason for optimism would be that Nico meets expectations and he takes that step forward, which makes some of the personnel losses that they have around him less of a concern because they have an elite quarterback.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I didn't write Nico down because I'm not sold that he could do it. No, I don't. I'm not questioning his talent or ability or even the system. So they got all those pieces, but it's more about retooled offensive line, retooled receiving core, lost your standout running back. So that's a lot to throw at a quarterback that is still developing, that is not quite where Tennessee fans want him to be, but he's got it in him to get there. So again, I'm not confident in it, but I'll tell you what I am confident in, Stephen, and this is what I wrote down. Josh Heupel's ability to adjust and being elite in the running game, regardless of who the running back is, seemingly regardless of who the offensive line is. I mean, they have been outstanding running the football. So you put those pieces together, and when I say Heupel's ability to adjust, I think he did what had to be done, and he took a lot of heat. He's taking heat from us, because of Shade, even low T Heupel. They're not high flying and scoring like they once were. Now they showcased that some last year, but Heupel was smart enough to know, hey, we got to run the ball, we got to play defense, and if we do that, we can win some games. They made the college football playoff. So yeah, it ended in disaster, but one coach, and I love this coach too, but I called him out on here, and I think it's valid. One coach that didn't adjust is Lane Kiffin. Being crazy with going for it on these fourth downs. Why in the world would you do that when your offensive line is an issue and the strength of your team is the defense? I don't know, but it cost him. It cost him big time against LSU. It cost him against Florida. And, against Kentucky, they couldn't pick up a third down to save their life, and it cost them the college football playoff. So not all these coaches adjust. People think they adjust. Not all of them do. Josh Heupel showed his willingness to do it. We obviously know that he's got the acumen, the knowledge, whatever you want to call it, to create a high-scoring offense. I think he's still got that in him. I think, quite frankly, the quarterback was not ready for that. And now, he better be this year, to your point, because it's going to be on his shoulders.
I think I try to think about the best way to word this, but almost an inability to be less stubborn is a good thing for coaches. Like knowing your strengths and weaknesses and also being willing to adapt. Because, I mean, to your point, like Tennessee under Hendon Hooker had one of the most explosive offenses in the country, and people like me are looking around trying to figure out where the heck did it go. And they just morphed into a running and defensive team last year. And a lot of credit to Tim Banks too, because he kind of had some early criticism, put together a good group last year. And of course, I know Tennessee's defense didn't play well at Ohio State, but I mean, Ohio State sliced up Oregon. They sliced up Notre Dame. They did it to Texas. So they did it to everybody. So I think Tennessee's in an interesting spot because they got there last year. They got to the playoff. Right. So now what's the next step now? And I think that's what'll be interesting to see how Heupel and this team adjust, because it does have to, like, Nico's going to have to take that step forward if Tennessee wants to get back and potentially win a playoff game or two next year.
And something we said all last season, they blew up the secondary. That was a huge question mark. They're kind of blowing up the receiving core. If the receivers are as good, or make a bigger turnaround as the defensive backs did, Tennessee's going to have one heck of an offense. All right, let's move on to Texas. Steve, what's got you so optimistic? There's a lot to be optimistic about with the Longhorns. What's tops of your list?
I think it's easy to say Arch Manning here, but I'll go with a bigger picture thing here, and that is Texas is knocking on the door. They are close. And I think if you keep knocking on that door as a program, similar to Georgia and similar to some others we've seen in recent years, if you keep getting close, eventually you will break through. And so I think Arch's development, maybe raising the ceiling. Sarkisian has built a strong foundation. They've got, a great staff there in Austin. CJ Baxter coming back at running back to go with a good group already. It feels like Texas Some people picked him number 25.
Yeah, and I was nervous, Steven, that you were going to take mine, but I'm glad you didn't. I knew Arch would be at the top of the list, but so I didn't go that way either. But I went with elite pass rushers with Simmons and Hill back. I know you love those guys, and I think they could. They've already breaking out. You can't call them breakout candidates if they're already broken out. But dynamic duo. I mean, there could be their version of what South Carolina was last year. So just a lot to like. And again, you're getting so close, but not getting over the hump. They got all this money to spend. I know they weren't that active in the portal, at least not yet. We'll see how active they are. Maybe they don't need to be active. I mean, they're not one that adds 20 guys a cycle, but what they do is they pinpoint needs and then they attack it aggressively in the transfer portal. So I anticipate Texas will add guys in the spring window. But if they don't, that tells me they're happy with where they're at, and maybe the only ones they add are some depth pieces. So if there's a program like Ohio State that wants to buy itself a championship, Texas is right at the top of the list. That is already there, and may just need a little extra push.
I think the fact that Texas has been somewhat quiet in the portal is actually a good thing. I think that tells me they feel real good about their roster. And some of their additions, like Cole Brevard from Purdue, Travis Shaw from North Carolina, they kind of fit what they did last year, which is they went out and got guys who can fit their defensive line, play some snaps. Maybe they don't have to be starters. They can be, run stuffers or whatever. Like it still is, like cliche as this sounds, being good at the line of scrimmage and having big dudes who can stop the run and get after the quarterback is good. So Texas has those boxes checked off. So I'm maybe they add in the spring window, Mike, but I think they should actually feel really good about where they are right now.
Mm-hmm. All right. How about A&M? What's your most optimistic thing about the Aggies?
I'm going to go with offensive growth. All 5 starters back on the offensive line. I really like this offensive line's potential for next season. Then you add in 2 receivers who are big time upgrades. Kevin Concepcion can kind of be a Swiss Army knife. He can be a returner. He can be a receiver, take some handoffs. However he needs to be used, he is a weapon. Mario Craver, we saw it at Mississippi State. Some big plays there. They have added much needed big play potential at receiver, and that should help Marcel Reed. They've got a deep group of running backs. All of the ingredients are there to take a step forward in year 2 under offensive coordinator Colin Klein.
Yeah. Hey, you almost hit mine right on the head. I thought you were going to take it there, Steven. I just went a little bit more simplistic, but very similar themed. They return 4 offensive linemen that are technically designated returning starters. So, and why? I mean, you can make that case for anybody. If you got 4 returning offensive linemen, that is incredibly valuable, and it is for anybody. But I think it's really valuable for Colin Klein and his system, and Mike Elko, what they're wanting. And when Texas A&M was 7-1 in the conference, it was because they were averaging over 200 yards per of rushing per game, and that dropped, I think, below 98 in the rest of the month. So again, that's what you want. You want your defense facing less snaps, and how do you accomplish that? You accomplish that by running it down the opponent's throats, and with Marcel Reed, with the weapons he's got, yeah, the passing game's got to get better. But I think A&M's bread and butter, as long as Colin Klein is running the offense, is going to be the running ball or the running game. And if they can be highly effective there, that's exactly the DNA of what Coach Mike Elko wants to be.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, Mike. I mean, you've got Amari Daniels, Le'Veon Moss, and Reuben Owens all coming back next year. That has got to be one of the deepest backfields in college football to go with a veteran offensive line. And now Marcel Reed has room to improve, and he still has to prove like what is his actual ceiling. But they've given him all of the tools. Like your receivers are better. You've got these great running backs, and now your coordinator can spend the whole offseason developing and tweaking to fit what he needs. I think if they're if there's one thing that I would like to still see out of this team is kind of what Mike Oko said after the bowl game. Need to see some more defensive backs maybe come into the programs. But I like the potential of this offense for sure.
Yeah. So, all right. So, last but not least, them fighting Vanderbilt Commodore. Steve, what tops your list there?
It's pretty easy for me, Mike. It's the return of Diego Pavia, the SEC chaos agent, after a fantastic debut last year, not only from the on-field production impact, but the off the field, sort of the belief that Vanderbilt has. It changed the culture. I think every time that Vanderbilt steps on the field with Pavia at quarterback, they believe they can win those games. So there's a whole mindset change, but it's also what he can do for this offense and the production and having a second season to take this offense to another level. And I'm very optimistic about Diego Pavia's return for 2025.
Yeah, I said something similar. I just said the return or year 2 of the New Mexico State crew. Come on down. Let's see what we can get out of this group, led, of course, by Diego Pavia and Jerry Kill and Tim Beck and Eli Stowers. And I think they've even added another receiver from that team. I mean, if there's anybody left to add, just keep adding them. You know what I mean? Because it's worked well for our New Mexico State junior squad over here, but
they didn't get that New Mexico State offensive lineman who transferred to Kentucky. It's like the one miss. Like he was considering Michigan and Kentucky, but and Nebraska.
The one that got away.
Yep.
I mean, Diego must have said, you know what? That guy's overrated anyway. You know what I mean? So, yeah, I just love the fact that Vanderbilt is no longer a cupcake in this league. In fact, they've won multiple conference games for the first time in a decade probably. So shout out Vanderbilt. We love that they're competitive now. And I mean, that may have been the most, it's wild that it's, we live in a moment and it's college football's come to an end and it's Ohio State, Big Ten, yada, yada, yada. Dude, I think Vanderbilt beating Alabama was the best game of the year. I mean, it was the first time in 40 years they had done that, so I don't know that there was a better, unless you're an Alabama fan, of course. But I don't know if there was a more shocking, stunning, this is college football moment. Ohio State, that to me, that's fine. They're semi-pro now. Vanderbilt is college. You know what I mean? Like beating number one, being unranked. Diego Pavia, he probably made $1 million just off that one win, and more power to him.
Program changing win. I think fair to say for Clark Lee, because I mean, certainly they would have been better this season, even if they didn't beat Alabama compared to last year, but it completely changed, I think, how we view the trajectory here. With Pavia coming in, not only are they just better, I think it sort of went from, can Clark Lee survive this season? How's he going to get to 2025 as the head coach? But now I think there's kind of this belief that, hey, Vanderbilt can also play in this NIL space. They can do a good job of evaluating. They got the right offensive coordinator, and Jerry Kill's a big part of that as off the field. But also, I mean, it's not like, Mike, this too. Like in past years, Vanderbilt, they'd be 2-10 we get to 0-8 here, and it would be like, it'd be struggling to find. Like, there's a lot interesting about this program going into 2025.
Yeah, cousin. DeVerend, I'm sure I butchered that. Give Vandy a real scoreboard. They've earned it. That's another thing. They're going to have a real scoreboard. The stadium's completed. It's going to be one of the nicest facilities in the damn country. So cannot wait for that. Steven, man, we took up so much of your time, over an hour and a half here, talking some SEC football on January 27th. It's never that far, Steven. If you remember it, you feel it in your heart. If you just talk about it enough, it feels like college football season, doesn't it?
It'll be here before we know it, Mike. There's hey, Hawaii starts spring practice on February 3rd. So if you're like me and you're like looking for college football things, you can go check out like the highlights of like Hawaii's quarterbacks throwing passes on February 3rd. Or I guess we got the Super Bowl. Well, spring practice after. There's really no off season anymore with portal, and there'll be the NFL draft coming up. So yeah, and it never stops. I'm ready. Sign me up. I'm ready for 2025.
Absolutely. Well, before you go, Steven, as always, can you remind the cousins how to follow you, how to find your work?
Absolutely. You can check out all my work at athlonsports.com. Got the top 25, got some early conference predictions up there too. You can follow me on Twitter at Athlon Steven, Steven L CFB, over on the Facebook and Instagrams.
All right, Steven, I thank you so much for joining us and dropping all this knowledge on us. We appreciate each and every one of you for hanging out. We'll catch you on the next one.
Hey, buddy, this beer's for you, Mike, and Cousin Shane. That SEC podcast loves the Pirate, and the Pirate loves that SEC podcast. Hail